you new to real estate, or are you just looking for a quick refresher? You've come to the right place. I'm Cheyenne Taraciano, and this is The Road to Sold. Today's class is going to be on how to write a clean purchase agreement when you're representing a buyer. I highly recommend you go ahead and open up your laptop or computer, pull up your WIN forms, your car account, and follow along through the purchase agreement as we go through it. I may give you some information on certain clauses that might be effective when you're writing your purchase agreement. You can immediately save those into your guys' car account as well as we go through this. I did tell you guys I was going to break up purchase contracts into 3 different sections, and that is super important because these car agreements are so bulky and they're hard to memorize all the different clauses, and it's hard to understand how we are working with the purchase agreement throughout the period of time of a listing, a transaction, or whether or not you're working with a buyer. So what I've done is I've broken it into 3 different segments. Today, we're going to focus just on how to write a California residential purchase agreement when you're working with a buyer and the different clauses that you need to be aware of when you're writing these contracts. Okay, everybody, let's get started this morning. Today we're going to be talking about the California Residential Purchase Agreement and how to write a beautiful contract as soon as you get started when you're working with a buyer. We're going to talk about the different ways that you want to focus on the clauses that are incorporated into the purchase agreement, and I want you guys to really be able to understand all of the different concepts of why we're writing the purchase contracts the way that we are. So let's dive in today on how to write a California Residential Purchase Agreement. Okay, the first thing that you're going to see on the screen is your disclosure regarding real estate agency relationships. This is a document that's going to pull up every single time you go to start a brand new purchase agreement when you're representing a buyer. The reason why all of these documents are pulling up automatically alongside of your purchase agreement, even though the only thing that you happen to want is a purchase agreement, is because it's required to be completed and filled out alongside of your purchase contract. So you can't ignore these forms. Not only can you not ignore these forms, but it's very important as far as your transaction goes on the legal side of things that they're dated in the same dates that are referenced in your purchase contract. That's why they're included with the purchase agreement when you first begin. That's why also agency is the very first document that you come to. In the state of California, you're required to discuss agency with your clients when you first begin working with them. And a lot of agents don't do this correctly, or they forget to do these disclosures if they just go straight to the contract. And then you'll find that they might date them incorrectly. Your dates that are going to be on all of the disclosures that are incorporated into your California residential purchase agreement when you pull it up must be dated exactly the same as your California residential purchase agreement. Inside your disclosure regarding real estate agency relationship, what you're actually going to be discussing with your clients is that you're working for them. So if you're representing a buyer, which is the class that we're talking about today, you're letting them know that you have a fiduciary responsibility to them, that you're always going to be open and honest with them, and you're always going to be acting in their best interest, but also being honest with them at the same time. So sometimes that means telling them the negative stuff along with the positive stuff. We're not here just to make sure that we're telling our buyers everything that they want to hear. We're here to make sure we're representing them to the best of our ability so they know everything it is that they're doing within this transaction. And this is what agency disclosure is discussing, and you have to have it signed immediately when you begin working with your contract. Now, along the bottom side of it, you're going to see that a lot of these fields should be auto-populating. I don't begin by typing in the bottom of the disclosure for agency. When I start writing a purchase agreement, I go directly to the purchase agreement itself. And then as I begin typing in the purchase agreement, everything else is going to auto-populate on all of the other forms within CAR. And every single time you check a box on the purchase contract within CAR, it's going to automatically bring in those required documents that you're stating are now going to be incorporated into your purchase agreement. So don't worry about beginning typing when it comes to this disclosure regarding real estate agency relationships. Page 2 on real estate agency relationships is just a page that's going to be your overflow page. So it's going to talk more in detail about what agency is and the civil codes that are referenced in and around agency. Now, I'm going to be going through some of these disclosures very quickly today because today's class is primarily focused on this purchase agreement. I do have a full class on disclosures. We're going to talk about these more in detail. So I'm just going to quickly highlight what these forms are and get us to the purchase contract as quickly as possible today. Okay, the next one is fair housing and a discrimination advisory. Obviously, we're going to be making sure that we're presenting this to our clients when we first write an offer, and it's going to be involved in your listing agreements and on your buy side as well. So this is going to be included in anything that you do, and of course, we're going to make sure that we are representing our clients alongside of the fair housing and discriminatory advisory that's included here. Possible representation of more than one buyer or seller. Now, this is kind of an interesting form. It always seems a little bit backwards that it's involved in the purchase agreement, because we know immediately when we write in this offer whether or not we're going to have dual representation or not. Now, this form, possible representation of more than one buyer or seller, means that if the listing agent brokerage and the selling agent brokerage are the same, so if you have RE/MAX All Pro on the listing side, RE/MAX All Pro on the selling side, you now have a dual agency, even if the agent who's representing that particular buyer is different than the agent that's representing the seller. It's dual agency if it's the same brokerage. So this you have to disclose to your clients up front whether or not dual agency is going to exist. However, the form is still required to be signed even when dual agency doesn't exist, which is kind of the odd thing about this particular form. So yes, this form is always required. It's supposed to be presented when you're working with your clients. And this is where a lot of people get confused about this dual agency form. Every single one of these forms that I've already gone through, the fair housing, the agency disclosure, and possible representation of more than one buyer or seller, they're actually supposed to be signed prior to ever writing that first contract, because you likely already have some form of agency existing with your client. So normally when you first start representing a client, it means that you're actively showing them properties. You are acting as their agent. You're using the key boxes to get inside of the listings. You're showing them the listings. You're running comps. You're searching properties for them. As soon as you start working with a client, agency begins existing. So all of these forms that we've discussed are technically already supposed to be signed. They're supposed to be signed upon maybe an initial buyer consultation. But the California Association of Realtors knows that that just never happens. So they've included them in the purchase agreement when you're officially writing an offer. So although we know whether or not we're dual agents or not, this form was supposed to be discussed with our clients prior to ever getting into a situation that was going to land us in a potential for dual agency or not. And that's why this form is here, even though you already know whether or not you're going to be doing dual agency or not. That's why this form is incorporated into the contract. Is the discussion needs to happen on what dual agency is and what that means for the buyers and whether or not they're okay with having dual agency as well. So this is why dual agency is in the contract, even though you know if it's dual agency or not already. All right, next is wire fraud and electronic funds transfer advisory. This is a super important form, and it's now in the purchase contracts as well because we're having so much fraud involved in real estate. And this is one of those things that you think is never going to happen to you, and then it does, and then you hit this panic mode. So it's very important that you actually take time to pause when you reach the wire fraud and electronic funds advisory and discuss this with your clients. It's very important to know that there are people that are out there that are constantly searching emails, and they're scanning them for purchase contracts. They're scanning them for the words wire, escrow, transaction. They're scanning all of our emails to try to insert themselves into this transaction and create fake wiring instructions that they might send to your buyers. Now, if they do this and your buyer gets a set of fake wiring instructions and wires their money to this scammer who might be out there, it's virtually impossible to get that money back. The money has left their account. It has gone to an account that is not the escrow company's account, and you can't get that money back fast enough to close your transaction, possibly not ever. So it's very important that when you're inside of a transaction or getting ready to begin a transaction, you want to let the buyers know that they are never supposed to be wiring money without getting the escrow company on the phone with them and saying, hey, I'm getting ready to send you a wire for my earnest money deposit. My earnest money deposit is a $5,000 deposit here, and I want to make sure that I have the correct routing number and the correct account number so that my money is secure. If they don't make that phone call, this is not covered by any insurance company that is in existence because the escrow company was never aware of it whatsoever. The money was taken before it ever reached escrow, so it's not covered by any insurance that an escrow company may end up having whatsoever. So you have to make the phone call to the escrow company, and please be sure you make sure that your buyers are doing that. These fraudsters are very good at collecting earnest money deposits and final amounts to close, because what they tend to do is they copy your escrow officer's email address almost exactly. They might just be missing one letter, or one letter is changed in it, so it looks so official. They copy every single thing that you can imagine. Now, throughout the year, we see a potential of 2 to 3 fraud cases within our own company that happen, that we thankfully can catch most of the time, because the buyers are aware that it might not be accurate. So they'll double check with us, hey, is this really the correct information? And if they call, or if they forward us the email that they receive, then we're able to double check that information. But if they just randomly wire that information, we're not able to catch it. So think about how much this could actually happen in your transaction, and please make sure you're protecting your buyer's funds by discussing this wire fraud advisory with them. Okay, buyer homeowners insurance advisory. Now, this is a form that's also important to discuss with your buyers, and I'm glad they brought it forward into the contract portion of it. Insurance has been changing in the state of California drastically over the last few years, and they need to start shopping for their insurance policies as quickly as they can. This is built within the contract, and they usually have a specified period of time within their contingencies to search for that perfect insurance policy for them. But with all the changes that are happening within the state of California, the earlier they shop for this, the less surprises that they're going to have. Insurance is getting a little bit more expensive. Boundary lines of insurance are changing. Insurance companies are kind of pulling out of California. A lot of them are pulling out of California. So you want to start this shopping process as quickly as possible. So the Buyer's Homeowner Insurance Advisory is going to discuss some of the insurance requirements and some of the goals that you want your buyers to be doing while they're writing their offer or getting ready to get this offer submitted. Okay, so now we finally reached the California Residential Purchase Agreement, and this is where our class is really diving in and starting for today. You want to make sure that when you write your residential purchase agreement for the very first time, it is the cleanest offer that you can possibly write. Now, I think sometimes agents just get so excited that they finally have a buyer who's ready to write an offer, and they're tired and they're exhausted. They're tired of showing property. Maybe this buyer was a little extra difficult. Maybe you're incredibly busy. So sometimes agents aren't taking the time that it takes to make sure the offers are written extremely clean, and it leads for problem transactions later. So you want to make sure that you're not doing this and you're really taking your time when it comes down to filling this out properly, because if you don't, then you're going to be stuck doing a lot of different addendums to correct errors that you could have fixed upon the initial writing of this contract. So let's make sure you really understand all of the different terms of the contracts and why you're writing the contract the way that you are to best protect your transaction and your buyer within the transaction. So you'll see on the top left-hand side of the page, it says date prepared. On date prepared, this is literally the date that you are writing the offer. Has nothing to do when this offer is fully executed, and it has nothing to do with when the buyer signs this particular offer. There could be a couple of day lag between your date prepared and when your signatures happen. That's okay, that's perfectly fine. Me personally, if I'm writing an offer, I do freshen my date prepared to when I'm actually preparing it, because sometimes there can be a couple of days that go by, so I might refresh that date prepared. It's also important to recognize that date prepared on the top left-hand corner is the date that you're going to reference throughout the entire transaction. That is the date of the contract that you're going to write on every addendum, every request for repair, or anything that you do to change this contract or modify this contract throughout the entire contractual period. That's the date that you're going to be using. Line number 1A, you're going to see is your offer is from. So it says line number 1 is your offer, line number A, this offer is from. You'll see that I'm using Donald J. Trump as our buyer today, and Mr. Joe Biden is our seller today. So in this offer, you've seen that I wrote the name as Donald J. Trump as our buyer. You're going to immediately pause in this section of the contract, and you're going to have a conversation with your buyers. You're going to say, hey, how would you like to go on title? Whatever I write here on your offer is what we're saying your legal name is going to be when we write this offer. Now, let's assume that I've been working with Donald J. Trump for the past 30 days, but I've never called him Donald. I've called him Don for the past 30 days. Probably never used his middle initial when I'm talking to him. I'm not going to make the assumption that I'm going to write this offer to Don Trump. That's the incorrect assumption. You need to have the conversation with your buyer and let them know that the name you put here on the contract is how they're going to be going on title. Now, if you get it wrong, that's okay, but then you're going to have to do an amendment while you're in escrow. That's one more signature that you're going to have to track down. Not only is that one more signature that you're going to have to get during the middle of your transaction, but now escrow also has to amend their escrow instructions. And your lender also has a loan going. So we have 3 different entities that we're working with, 3 different companies that we're working with, where the name of your buyer has to match. The buyer wants their names to match on all of these things. So the note that's going to come from the lender and all the loan documents, that name needs to match what you put on your contract and needs to match what you put in escrow. So let's say we've been calling this gentleman Don Trump the entire time, and I write Don Trump on this purchase agreement. The lender might have Donald J. Trump. Escrow now has Don Trump, and we've got to resync all of these together later. So if you get it wrong, you're going to make not just you redo this contract, but you're going to make you, the lender, and escrow have to potentially modify how their documents read. So this is definitely the incorrect way to do it. You want to sync all of this together from the very beginning. So you ask the buyer, how do you want to go on title? And he says, I want to be Donald J. Trump. That's my legal name. By the way, that name also matches what's on my driver's license because they're going to have to show proof of their legal name when they go to complete their signatures in escrow in front of a notary. So you want to make sure the name is 1, correct to match their driver's license, 2, how they actually want to go on title. Now, something else that you're going to want to double check is what does your pre-approval read that you got from your lender? This is a big tell for you guys of what this buyer may have already told their lender. So if you look at your pre-approval that you got from your lender and it says Don Trump, but your buyer is sitting in front of you and your buyer just said, no, I'm Donald J. Trump, then you're going to want to pick up the phone, call the lender and just say, hey, I'm working on the purchase contract for Don today. By the way, he wanted to let me know that he's going to be taking title as Donald J. Trump. I see your pre-approval is as Don Trump. Just in case you haven't corrected the legal name there, that you guys are kind of all on the same page. Those should match. It just creates a little bit less work if you handle it at the very beginning. Okay, so line number 2, this is just your property address. So you're going to write out your property address. Below that, you're going to write your city, you're going to write the county, you're going to write the zip code. The assessor's parcel number should be written out exactly how I have it. You'd like to make sure you're using the dashes and using the dashes in the correct spaces. If you don't know, you should be able to pull this up with the multiple listing service, or you should also be able to pull this up in the tax documentation that you've pulled up. So we use kind of CRS tax, and you can find that information there. If you're not using the CRS tax realist section, that's fine. You can get it from a lot of other different places. If you don't know where the dashes go, just take them out completely. Make sure you have all the digits there. Sometimes people get those dashes a little bit wrong. But make sure that the dashes are there. If you know them, if you don't know them, take them out. This particular parcel that we're working with today is in LA County. The format for LA County is what you see on the screen right now, 3 digits, 2 digits, 4 digits. If you're working within Kern County, it's going to be separated a little bit differently. So every county is going to reference those assessor parcel numbers a little bit differently. So keep an eye out on that. All right, next up, you're going to be going through agency. So now we're working in paragraph number 2. And I want you guys to get very familiar to working with paragraph numbers and the letters that coincide with those paragraph numbers, because that's how you should be referencing everything when you're talking about your contract. Every time you do a counteroffer and every time you do an addendum, you're going to be countering the terms of this agreement, and you want them to match the exact contract. There should be no room for gray area. It should be identical matching to the contract verbiage and numbers that are there. So I'm working on contract number 2A and B for agency. So inside agency, one, it's telling you in this contract, there's going to be an agency disclosure that's going to define what the agent's responsibilities are. And then in agency letter 2B, you're going to be talking about agency relationship. Now, in our sample today, I said that RE/MAX All Pro is the listing brokerage. I also said that RE/MAX All Pro is the selling brokerage. So now we know we have dual agency because it's the same brokerage. In my example today, not only am I saying brokerage, I am putting myself as the agent on both sides. Either way, we have dual agency. But in my example today, I said Remax All Pro is the listing brokerage firm, Remax All Pro is a selling brokerage firm. Beneath that, you need to check the box who you're representing. So I've checked the box that I'm representing both the buyer and seller because I have dual agency within the brokerage. Now, directly next to that, I need to make sure that these license numbers are correct. Now, if you get the license number incorrect, you're going to have to do an addendum to make sure those license numbers are correct later. So take the time to make sure that those license numbers are correctly input inside your contract. It is a recognizing feature of how to find that particular agent or that brokerage. So if you don't get that correct, your broker is going to ask you to correct that later within your transaction. Now, CAR is really great because when you're filling out these forms, it does begin to memorize all of these items. So once you start entering in your license numbers, it should remember those in the system. So every single time you go to write a contract, some of these numbers are already set up there. I actually highly recommend that you set up a purchase agreement template within CAR, and you can put a lot of these things built into your template already. So then you just have to make modifications to your contracts, which will make writing contracts much more efficient and clean for you when you're working with them later. Okay, so in our example, again, I am representing both clients. This is going to be a dual agency situation. Now, beneath that, it is going to talk about potentially competing buyers and sellers and the possible of representation of more than one buyer or seller. So in my situation, I do have dual agency. So the box is checked right there under item number 2D that there's a possible representation of more than one buyer or seller. That should be automatically checked no matter what, because it should be pulling into your contract. If it's not, double check it because I do have dual agency in this situation. All right. Now we're working within item number 3 of our purchase contract on page 1. And this graph is where all of the costs are going to go within your contract. These are all the fine details about the contract that you're going to be concerned with when you're writing the offer. Everything else beyond this contract is really going to be talking about contingencies and what happens if everything goes wrong during this transaction. But the nuts and bolts of the transaction are going to be within this grid that you see in paragraph 3. Paragraph 3 is very long. It spans multiple pages within the purchase agreement. So just know that if you're seeing the grid, you're within paragraph 3. Okay. So in paragraph 3, line item number A is your purchase price. This is how much your buyer is wanting to make an offer on the property. So in my scenario today, my buyer wants to write an offer at $500,000. Item number 3B is going to be referencing your close of escrow date. On your close of escrow date, there's a couple of things that you need to be concerned with. One, have you spoken to the lender? Does the lender know if they can actually close this escrow in 30 days or not? Now, my buyer could be telling me they want a 30-day escrow, and that's wonderful. Maybe they want to move in 30 days, but if your lender cannot meet a 30-day escrow, it's very important that you make sure that you're working on the timeline that the buyer wants, but also that the lender can meet. Normally, you're going to know this before you ever get to the period of time where you're writing a contract. If you don't have all the details on your buyer's loan and the capabilities of the lender and what you're working with as far as the borrower financing goes, then you need to pick up the phone and you need to call your lender at this point in time and get these fine details so that you can make sure your contract is correct. Now, we're pausing on close of escrow date because this right here is one of the most sensitive topics when it comes to closing your transaction. So if you don't get your close of escrow date right, and you start getting to day 30 of your close of escrow, and there's no way you're going to make a 30-day escrow close, you're about ready to have a nightmare on your hands. Your stress level is going to be highly increased. Your buyer's stress is going to be increased. The sellers are going to be angry. The listing agents are going to be angry. Escrow is going to be angry. Everyone's going to be having the stress on their shoulders like weights there that they can't take off purely because we didn't write our contract correctly to make sure we can meet that close of escrow date. It's far better to tell the listing agent, you know what, I think I can close in 30 days, but I'm going to pad it because I want to actually make sure that everybody's happy in this transaction. If we close early, wonderful, but I want that date padded enough that everybody is going to have a smooth, seamless transaction. Now, I've written this offer for a 30-day close after acceptance. So after all signatures are on this document, we're going to have 30 days, so a fully executed contract. 30 days later will be your close of escrow date. The other thing that I could have chosen to do is I could have checked the box beneath it and said, we're going to close escrow on or after a specified date and time. I'm sorry, not on or after, on a specified date and time. So you can either count 30 days out, or maybe you want to count 35 days out or 40 days out. You're giving yourself a little bit of a pad and you want to choose a close of escrow date. That is okay. Now, if I leave this alone as a 30 days after acceptance date, what happens if that 30th day falls on a Saturday or a Sunday? What happens if that 30th day falls on a Friday and you didn't get the house closed like you said you were going to? Not only are you not going to close on Friday, but you don't have a day or two of a buffer after that. Now it's impossible to close on Saturday. It's impossible to close on Sunday. So if you miss your deadline and your COE was set for a Friday, your buyer's not just a day late in closing and mad at you. Your buyer's potentially not getting to move into their house for 2 or 3 days because you have a weekend in there. You can't do anything about these weekends. So if I'm really particular about this, one of the things that I've done in the past before is I can set my close of escrow date for a Monday or a Tuesday, right? Then if you're a day or two late in closing, it's okay. You have time to close it within that week still, so your buyer can still move into the property over that following weekend, which is usually what they want to do. And it might not sound perfectly ideal to have a Monday or a Tuesday close of escrow date, but it's not too bad because then your buyer still has time to change over utilities. You have the electric, you have the water, you have the gas that needs to be set up. They have time to coordinate with internet. They have time to get the trash cans to their property. They have time to coordinate all of these things before their moving date officially happens. If they close on a Thursday or a Friday, and they may not be thinking about utilities or internet or trash service, then they could be moving in on a Saturday or Sunday and they're just throwing their trash in these big bags on the front porch, trying to move in smoothly, but it can't be all that smooth because they still don't have full utilities on, or they may have some other things that are happening that they didn't get an opportunity to coordinate. So it's definitely not bad to have a close of escrow date Tuesday, Wednesday, or even a Monday is really not that bad. So be careful watching your close of escrow dates. The second thing on this, or are we on item number 100 here with your close of escrow date? I'm not sure. But when it comes to close of escrow date as well, another conversation that you need to have with your buyers when you're writing the offer is, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, I don't think you're going to close in 30 days. Even if I write 30 days, the chances that it's going to be 31 days or 32 days is very, very possible. I don't want you to get excited about a 30-day close of escrow. I don't want you to look at day 30 as your close of escrow date. I want you to think of this as day 30 plus a few days of a pad to get this closed on time. I've been working in this industry for a long time, and meeting an exact close of escrow date, I can promise you that doesn't always happen. So I'd rather be proactive and have this conversation with you ahead of time so you're mentally prepared for your close of escrow date to understand that that 30-day escrow may not actually happen. And you know what? If you're representing a seller, that conversation should happen also. If you don't pause and have this conversation and prepare them that you might be a day or two late in closing, maybe 5 days late in closing, then it's kind of your fault when you get to the close of escrow date and everybody's mad at you. Because what were they prepared for? They were prepared for a 30-day escrow because you wrote a 30-day escrow. So they've mentally already calendared that date. They're expecting that date. When you don't meet that date, you're failing. Now, if you put a 30-day escrow and you have the proactive conversations with your clients to let them know that although we're writing 30 days, there is a good possibility that it may not actually just be 30 days. We could be 35, right? Now, if you're working with an incredible lender, a local direct endorsement lender, the chances that they're going to meet their close of escrow date on time is pretty darn good because they know that they are accountable. They have some responsibility for their clients. They're easily found. You can walk into the lender's office. You can make sure you're getting your updates and staying on top of files. If you are working with a bank, we've discussed this a little bit before, Bank of America, Chase Bank, US Bank, Wells Fargo, you name it, you will never meet a 30-day close of escrow date. I don't care what that bank tells you. So you prepare your client for that. If they want to use that bank, fantastic. We don't care who they use, but it is our job to manage timelines. So if you have a bank that you're working with, it's super important to make sure that you're going to give a buffer on that. I don't think I would ever write a contract, a 30-day escrow, if I was working with a bank or if my buyer wanted to be working with a bank. So definitely make sure that you pad that if you're working with a bank. Okay, we're going to be moving on to item number 3C, and this is your expiration of offer. All of your offers, when you write them, are set to expire within 3 calendar days after your buyer fully executes this agreement. So if I write this offer today and I submit this over to a listing agent and the agent is not responding for 2 or 3 days, at some point in time, this particular transaction will just close its book on its own, and it's just going to naturally go away because of this 3-day time period for the expiration of offer. Now, let's say on day 3, the seller issues you a counteroffer, but your offer's kind of expired at that point in time. The act of signing on a counteroffer re-engages the initial purchase contract. So it can be overrode. It doesn't mean that you have to write a new purchase contract if day 3 expires and you still want to work within this offer. It just means that this particular offer is considered closed after that 3-day period of time. All right, your initial deposit, we are now in the grid on page 1, paragraph 3D1. Your initial deposit amount. Now, it's very important that you gain knowledge as a buyer's agent in every single market that you're working with. And I'm not just talking about area, I'm also talking about whether you're in a seller's market or a buyer's market. How's the demand in the marketplace? What does that look like? Are there multiple offers on every single property? Are you duking it out with 20 other offers, or is there no other offers on file? You also do have to be cognizant of the area that you're working in. Now, if you are working in, for example, somewhere closer to San Francisco, you're working in Northern California, it's very common that you're going to get a deposit, an earnest money deposit, should be more of an expectation of maybe 2 to 3% of the sales price. If you are working in parts of LA, a 3% deposit would be pretty expected. Orange County, you may need to get 2 to 3%. In our particular marketplace that we're talking about today, for the focus of this purchase agreement, we're in Los Angeles County, northern Los Angeles County of Lancaster, Palmdale, even parts of Kern County with Tehachapi and Rosemont. You could do a 1% deposit. A 1% deposit is very acceptable in this marketplace, and it's pretty common in this marketplace. So you'll see that in the offer that I wrote today, I put that we're going to have a 1% initial deposit amount. Now, you probably need to know that information before you sit down with your buyer, because you want to counsel them on what is a really good, strong offer. Now, if I were to write just a $1,000 deposit on this purchase agreement, I can do that. I can choose to go less than what I kind of think is acceptable for an area, but you have to understand that this is going to go to a listing agent and this is going to go to a seller, and you might be competing with other offers. Now, a 1% deposit is pretty darn good, but less than 1% that the seller is going to think, gosh, they don't have very much skin in the game. That buyer can walk away if they only have a $1,000 deposit, and maybe they don't care about losing $1,000. I want my buyers to be a little bit more nervous to walk away. I want them really attached to this house and to this offer. I want to know they're committed. That is what your earnest money deposit is saying. Your earnest money deposit is saying how committed the buyer is to closing this transaction and what amount of money they're willing to risk. So if they're willing to risk more money in their earnest money deposit, then that's great, because it tells the seller that they're committed to closing this transaction. If you have someone that only writes a $500 deposit on a contract, they're not extremely committed to this process. So there's those things that you want to consider when you're writing an offer. Ideally, a minimum of 1% would be definitely something that you would want to see. There could be scenarios where you're going to be less than 1%. For example, if you're working with a VA buyer, they don't have to have a down payment. They don't have to have a big earnest money deposit because they're not going to be utilizing all of those funds. So that's somewhere where you might see a deposit that's a little bit lower. Maybe they go $2,500 on an earnest money deposit with a $500,000 purchase price. Maybe they're even a $1,000 deposit on a VA loan with a $500,000 purchase price. Your VA buyer still could choose to put more of an earnest money deposit down, and if that money is not utilized within their closing, whatever money is due back to the buyer would go back to the buyer at those points in time. But VA is definitely a little bit different of a purchase contract than the one that we're writing today, and deposits would be a little bit different than the one that you're writing today. So know your marketplace, know what deposits are standard for the marketplace, and be prepared to write that in your contract right there. Now, you will see that in the initial deposit amount on the right-hand side, it says additional terms. You can also put an earnest money deposit within 3 days or change it to later than 3 days of when you're actually going to put that deposit into escrow. Now, deposits are due to be within escrow within 3 days. And I want you to be careful also when you're reading verbiage in the contract. Most things in the contract are calendar days. So if you're discussing calendar days, you're talking Saturdays and Sundays as well. The earnest money deposit is due within 3 business days, which means that you're not going to be counting your Saturday and Sunday. So if Friday is day 1, then Monday is day 2, and Tuesday is day 3 for that earnest money deposit. You don't get to count the weekends. You're counting business days. You're not counting calendar days. So be cognizant when you're working on timelines and contingencies, whether or not the contract is utilizing calendar days or business days. Earnest money deposit is going to be working with those business days. All right, number 3D2. This is an increased deposit. Now, let's say you're working with a buyer and the buyer wants to put a 3% earnest money deposit, but they're only going to do 1% ahead of time, $5,000. And then next week, they're going to put in the additional 2% for another $10,000. That's acceptable. They can do that. Now, one of the things that you're going to want to make sure is that you include that additional deposit in liquidated damages. We're going to talk about liquidated damages a little bit more later in the contract, but this is the line item that we're going to be discussing. It's only if a deposit is made additional at a later point in time. And sometimes this happens, maybe a buyer had made a loan to somebody, that loan's not going to be paid back until next week. They're going to have more money and they're going to increase the deposit next week. All good and fine, but you need to make sure that's reincorporated back into liquidated damages clauses. Okay. So next up, we're going to be talking about the loan amount. Again, you should be having a conversation with your lender at this point in time to be discussing what the loan amount is going to be. In this particular scenario, I said my loan amount was going to be $400,000. I have that as 80% of the purchase price, which means that my buyer is putting 20% down. So on 20% down, the loan amount would be a $400,000 loan amount. Now, beneath that, I did put an interest rate not to exceed 6.75%. So if for some reason the loan comes back and it's only, the interest rate quoted is now 7%, my buyer has a little bit of protection here because I said they're not willing to continue with this transaction if the interest rate ended up being higher than 6.7%. You can put an interest rate here. You don't have to put an interest rate here. You can leave it blank if you choose to leave it blank. Now, if you're representing the buyer, you can put what the interest rate is that they were quoted, but I would recommend padding that interest rate a little bit. Maybe I would put 7% today. Maybe I would put 7.25% today. I'm definitely not just going to randomly guess this figure. It's not my job to discuss what that amount needs to be. I'm the real estate agent. I need to have this conversation with the lender. So you need to be talking to the lender about this particular item and see if there's an interest rate that you want to pop into the contract or not. You can choose to leave that blank. On the right-hand side, under additional terms, you're going to see that it's going to default to a conventional loan. So every single time you write a purchase contract, it's assuming it's going to be a conventional transaction. If it's not a conventional transaction, you need to check whether it's FHA, VA, seller financing, or other. So as soon as you decide to check one of those boxes, it's going to pull in any documentation that's required for an FHA loan or a VA loan. It'll automatically pull that into this contract that you're typing, and then you would be able to utilize that form immediately. You know it's going to exist in the transaction because it's going to pop it in. It's going to auto-populate that for you. Okay, next up we have Additional financed amount, this is if your buyer is going to be getting a first and a second. Usually that's not going to be applying in today's market. You might see that happen. So if there's a first and a second, you could put that under the additional financed amount right there. Next up is going to be occupancy type. So we're in grid number 3E3, and it's always going to default to a primary residence. If this is going to be an offer for a second home or for an investment property, you need to make sure you're checking the appropriate boxes at the bottom of the page. All right. Next up, on the top of page 2, I'm in paragraph number 3 still. This whole page is paragraph number 3. So I'm in paragraph 3, grid number G1. This is going to discuss seller credit. Now, it's a little bit confusing because CAR has, the attorneys that represent CAR, has created the verbiage to go in those boxes, and it looks like you should probably just use the boxes that are there. I don't recommend using those boxes that are there. I do recommend typing in whether or not you're going to have closing costs beneath that, because it's not very clear as what those closing costs should be allotted to. And escrow needs to know, what am I allowed to pay with these closing costs? Am I allowed to pay recurring and non-recurring closing costs? Am I allowed to pay VA non-allowables or not allowed to pay VA non-allowables? Now, in my particular situation today, my buyer really didn't need closing costs because you saw we were putting 20% down. However, I wanted to discuss verbiage with you guys because it's very important that it's written correctly. If you are representing an FHA transaction and they are asking for closing costs to be paid by the seller, you would write, seller to contribute $5,000 towards buyer's recurring and non-recurring closing costs, period. If they're looking for closing costs, that's what you want to write, recurring and non-recurring closing costs. Now, if you're representing a VA offer, you want to make sure you add that last bit in. So, seller to contribute $5,000 towards buyer's recurring and non-recurring closing costs, plus you want to make sure it can be utilized towards your VA allowable and non-allowables built within the contract. Now, you can clearly see that if I were to use the grid in G1, it doesn't really describe what those costs can be used for or not used for. So I highly recommend that you use the verbiage that I've typed into this contract before. If you would like to talk to your mentor or a team leader about any specific verbiage in this section of the contract, I highly recommend that you do that. You can also talk to your lender. Your lender may want specific verbiage in that particular section of the contract. Okay. Moving forward, next up we are going to be, I'm going to skip over item number G3. This really hasn't hit too hard in the state of California yet. This is whether or not the seller is going to be paying for the buyer's agent's commission if it was not already planned in the MLS. For the most part, what you're seeing in the state of California is within the multiple listing service, they're still paying a broker co-op fee to the buyer's agent. So if that's already built within the MLS, we don't really even need to worry about box number G3 at all. This is if you get a scenario where it says there's zero commission whatsoever. If that says zero commission, then we need to have a discussion about how we can potentially ask the seller to pay for your buyer's agent's commission. This shouldn't be hitting you too hard right now. You shouldn't see this very often right now. If you do, you're welcome to reach out to me and I'm happy to help you through that process. Okay. Now, item number H1, verification of all cash. You can see that the auto default for this already says it's attached to the offer. You need to have proof of funds available anytime you write an offer because the contract is assuming that you're going to have proof of funds attached to your offer. If you don't have it attached to your offer, it's going to say, okay, fine, you don't have it attached to the offer, then you need to check the box, I'll give you my proof of funds within 3 business days. Now, I don't know about you, but if I was the listing agent or a seller, I would never accept an offer where I have absolutely zero proof that they're going to have the funds to be able to close this transaction. I'm never going to open up escrow or accept an offer where I can't see proof of funds. So I really suggest that you make sure that your buyers have proof of funds attached to every single offer. Now, this is going to be both for verification of all cash and verification of down payment to close. You need to attach those to the offer. Not only do you need to attach those to the offer, but you need to read them. I guess we live in a pretty shady world these days where a lot of buyers, I think you see this with investors a lot, they change the details on their bank statements. So sometimes if it looks like things aren't adding up, well, they might not be. So be a little bit careful as if if those proof of funds are actually correct, and if they're new. Obviously, money that's held inside of a bank account can change very rapidly. People can use their money faster than you think it does. So if you have proof of funds that's aged 60 days, 90 days, you need a current proof of funds or the most recent proof of funds that you can possibly get. So I like to see proof of funds within about 30 days of when they write this offer, because I would consider that a little bit closer to an accurate proof of funds. Okay. Now, when you come down to verification of loan application, we're in grid paragraph 3, H3. This is verification of their loan application. Now, you're going to say that it's attached to your offer. Again, you need to have a full pre-approval if you're going to be showing your buyers, and you definitely have to have a full pre-approval to be writing an offer. On the right-hand side, under additional terms, you're going to see that there's 3 boxes that you can select: pre-qualification, pre-approval, and fully underwritten pre-approval. Now, a pre-qualification means that the lender has had a conversation with the buyer. They've taken all the information verbally. They have probably ran credit. They know their credit scores. They know their debts. They see their income. They might even have a paycheck or two, but they haven't fully pre-approved them yet. They haven't ran the application. They haven't really come up with a solid debt to income ratio yet. They haven't really put this through all the tests and trials to see whether or not this buyer is fully approved with no potential issues or not. They've just had the conversation and it kind of looks like it's going to be okay. So they've written you a pre-qualification letter. One step further is the pre-approval. The pre-approval means that now the lender has tax returns, 2 months bank statements, they have W-2 income, they have paycheck stubs to cover 30 days. They have all of the information that they need to really calculate everything that they could possibly need to be aware of themselves. So that is the lender, that is the person you're speaking to, writing all of the information, and they say, yeah, this looks good. I don't see any red flags here. I think we're going to be just fine. Okay. The next step up is going to be a fully underwritten pre-approval. Now, what this means is they've taken all of those details, they've submitted it to a computerized system. We call it DU usually. And that means once all this information they took on the loan application, they upload it into a system, and that system is going to generate conditions that are required to be met for this buyer to close. So once that comes back and the lender reviews all of the conditions that need to be met, that lender now knows, oh, wow, you know what? They are going to ding me for XYZ, or, oh my gosh, they're not going to let me use that additional income that my buyer receives for bonus pay. They're kicking it out. They're not going to let me use that bonus pay. You're going to get all of the details directly from DU of what they need to prove. And if the lender can't prove those items or complete those items that DU is asking for, they know that they have a potential issue there, right? So that is going to be closer to fully underwritten pre-approval. Now, it's a little bit deceptive when we say fully underwritten pre-approval because people think about this in a lot of different ways. Fully underwritten technically means that not only did you do that step of DU underwriting, but the underwriter, the person at the lender's office who is going to be reviewing the full file and checking off those documents has put their eyeballs on it. And they have reviewed the underwriting on their side of it as well. And now you have a fully underwritten pre-approval. It's an underwriter actually looking at it. Now, sometimes people will check the box fully underwritten pre-approval if they have DU, which is the computer generated findings. I do like to see DU. I do like to only write offers for buyers that have a fully underwritten pre-approval because I'm not just in this because I want to earn a quick commission. I don't like stressful situations. I don't want my buyers to be in them. And if I get into a situation where I only have a pre-qualification, I only have a pre-qualified buyer, and you get into that day 20 to 30 of a transaction and everything is falling apart, you're going to have sleepless nights. Not just you, but the seller is, and the escrow company is. Those ladies go home stressed out, you know. You put this burden on everybody else's shoulder because we're working off of a pre-qualified buyer, not a pre-approved buyer, or not a fully underwritten buyer. Same thing goes if you're a listing agent. I know you're excited when you get an offer, and if it's a really good, nice, clean offer, but if they're only pre-qualified, you're setting yourself up for a potential nightmare. you'd really like them to be fully underwritten. You really need some more details to get that done. You could include that in a counteroffer, that you want to see them fully underwritten prior to accepting this offer. There's things that you can do to protect your buyer and your seller. We're protecting our mental health when it comes to these items that we're looking at right here. Okay, next up, we're in grid number 3, and we are on item number J, final verification of condition. This means that the buyer, prior to the close of escrow, can do a final verification of the condition of the home. Usually they put that at 5 days prior to the close of escrow. I do see some people tighten that up to like a 3-day period of time, but the contract is going to auto default to 5 days where they're going to verify the condition of the home. Now, if they're going to assign this contract to anywhere else, sometimes there are wholesalers that like to buy houses and then assign the contract to somebody else. That's automatically set for 17 days within your contract. You don't see that very frequently, but you can take a peek at that. Next up, we're going through paragraph number 3L. 3L is talking about contingencies, so this is a pretty important section of the contract that you're going to want to go through. Your loan contingency for your buyer is going to auto default to 17 days. So you have the auto default 17 days for your loan for your buyer. If you need more days than that, then you need to override that. And in the or section, you could write 21 days after acceptance. All the way to the right, you can see that you could remove loan contingencies. Now, you're going to use caution on these contingency periods. You also have to analyze when you're talking about contingency periods, what kind of market that you are in. Is this a market that is in high demand? Are you competing with 20 other offers or not? Are there no offers on the property whatsoever? In a hot market, we were having people remove all contingencies. They were removing loan contingency. They were removing appraisal contingencies. They were removing every contingency in the contract just to get a contract accepted. Now, as an agent, we never want to see our buyers removing their contingencies. This is their protection to make sure the house is exactly what they want the house to be. Now, these contingencies aren't just a buyer's protection. They're also your protection as a buyer's agent, and it's the protection for the listing agent. If you're a listing agent, you might think that you want the buyer to remove all contingencies, but you really don't. You want them to have the time to analyze everything on the property. Then you want them to write everything off that they accepted it all, because now you're protecting your seller against lawsuits. So people like to think that getting a zero contingency is great if you're the seller. It's really not. It's a fake great, if you follow me, right? You might like the idea of it, but it's an actual terrible idea to have a zero contingency period. I really like to, as far as a risk reduction side of things, be sure that we have contingencies in place. I would say that a minimum contingency date should be at least 10 days. Going less than 10 days, it just doesn't show that your buyer has enough time to do their due diligence. And honestly, it should tell your seller, whoa, we're not giving the buyer enough time to do due diligence here. And my way to protect you as the seller is to make sure that the buyer does have a due diligence period, because we're going to try to protect us from risk reduction. We're going to try to protect the risk in this. We're going to do risk reduction, and we want them to go through that contingency period to accept every single term of this contract, okay? Now, I suggest that all these contingency periods remain at 17 days. They're built that way within the contract for a specific reason. It takes that long to get some of these investigations and reports back. So shortening this is really risking a lot as far as the buyers go and the sellers go. So you're going to see the auto default on your contract as 17 days. So your loan contingency, you have 17 days within this contract built in that the buyer needs to solidify their financing. They have 17 days to know for a fact the lender can close this. No more surprises after day 17. Day 17 is the day that we should be so committed on the loan. We are not expecting anything else to happen after that. We should be smooth sailing. That's what that means for your loan contingency. Your appraisal contingency, we also have 17 days. Now, with your appraisal contingency, what's going to end up happening is you're going to write this offer. As soon as you have an accepted offer, you're going to immediately send your accepted offer over to the lender. Once the lender gets this put together, they're going to have to send out all of their documentation to make sure that they're disclosing to their client properly upfront all of their fees and all of the disclosures that the lender has to disclose upfront. Then your lender is going to order the appraisal. This process takes a little bit of time. and the appraisers are going to put you in a queue. Now, depending upon how backed up an appraiser is or not backed up an appraiser is kind of the timeline to get your appraisal back. So if there's not a lot of transactions going on in our marketplace, you might get an appraisal back extremely quickly. But we've been in extremely hot markets before where we were lucky to get an appraisal back within 10 days. But 10 days from when? Not 10 days from when we wrote the contract. 10 days from when it was ordered. So you can see that from the point in time where you write this contract to the point in time where the lender orders that appraisal, you might have a 3-day lag. You might have more than that if you have a lender who's not on top of their game. You might have a 5-day lag. So if there's a 5-day lag from ordering the appraisal and you're in a hot market where the appraisers are taking 7 to 10 days to turn around that appraisal, you're going to be really pushing that appraisal contingency at a 17-day appraisal contingency. So even if you're going to shorten the contingency, I would never recommend shortening the appraisal contingency or the loan contingency. I really like those to be in place for as long as possible. You need those documents back to give ample amount of time to be able to negotiate a successful request for repair, or to be sure that your buyer really likes the responses that they're getting from those reports and investigations. So your appraisal has a 17-day contingency period. Now on the right-hand side, you can remove the appraisal contingency, but what happens? So I wrote this offer today at a $500,000 purchase price. If this property only appraises for $490,000, not $500,000, and I removed that appraisal contingency, I have taken away my buyer's right to cancel this contract due to a low appraisal. I can no longer cancel for that reason. I might have another reason to cancel, but it can't be for the appraisal issue because I removed that contingency. I really like the appraisal contingency to remain in place if I'm worried about the price of the property that I wrote. So let's say that the property was listed at $500,000, but I'm trying to cover my buyer's cost. So I write my offer at $515,000 to cover cost, or $510,000. I still need my appraisal contingency in there because it's not only got to appraise for that purchase price, but now I've got some concerns because I wrote it for over list price. I need to actually make sure that I believe it's going to be able to appraise for that amount, make sure I'm doing my CMAs, make sure I'm looking at every single closed property, like do I have a space in there or not? But those are considerations when you're talking about appraised value, but we're on contingencies. So the default is a 17-day contingency period. I do not recommend waiving your appraisal contingency. And if you are going to waive your appraisal contingency, you need to have a discussion with your buyers on what that means for them. If it doesn't appraise, what can they still back out and why can they back out? Have these conversations with them. Okay, next up you have your investigation of property. This is also set for 17 days. This is one of those that sometimes people like to shorten to like a 10-day investigation, or you may be asked by a listing agent to shorten to a 10-day investigation. It's possible to get some of your investigations done in 10 days. It could be possible to get the majority of your inspections done in 10 days. But this is your investigation for everything. So you're not just talking about a home inspection. If you have a septic, if you have a well, if you have all of these other things that you're going to be investigating, you have 17 days to get that done. Now, you have 17 days to get everything done when it comes to investigating the property. So let's walk through this a little bit. Within that 17 days, what can that look like? The first thing you're going to do is order a home inspection. That's pretty common. Well, what if that home inspection comes back? So let's say you're 5 days into the transaction now. You initially order your home inspection right away. You order that as quickly as possible. But it's going to take you time to do the inspection and get the inspection back. Well, when you get the inspection back, maybe the home inspector noted a lot of moisture in a particular area. So in reviewing that report, your buyer completely panics about the moisture and starts believing that there could be something like mold in the property or something really concerning to them in the property due to that water intrusion, and it scares them a little bit. Maybe they ask you to order a mold inspection. Well, now you're days into this contract and your buyer's asking for an additional investigation of the property. So it's not just for the home inspection. It's for you to get time for all of the inspections to come back to you, your wood destroying pest inspection, your home inspection, and the buyer ample enough time to go, okay, I've gotten some of these inspections back, but I'm panicking a little bit about the roof, or I'm panicking a little bit about the termite inspection that came back. Like, it looks like there's a lot of damage. I want something else reviewed. So you need time to do maybe a secondary inspection or investigation on an item that might happen to come back to you. So those are reasons why you might not want to decrease that investigation period shorter than the 17 days as well. Okay, so informational access to the property. So you'll see that a line item underneath the investigation of property is the buyers have access to the property for 17 days to do all of these inspections. So you get those 17 days to do the inspections that you need. And then over on the right-hand side, it's talking about the removal or the waiver of the contingencies. And this is going to talk about the waiver of the contingencies for all of the line items in the grid number 3L. This is all contingencies that are in there. It's talking about a waiver for these contingencies. So if you decide to waive any of the contingencies from line item L3 to L8, it's going to have you attach the contingency removal form and state which one of those you're going to be removing or not removing. Okay? Now, in grid number 3L, where are we at? 3L4, review of seller's documents. The buyer is going to be given 17 days to review all the documents that the seller provides to them. So the seller has to provide them in a timely manner, and the buyer has 17 days to review them for their accuracy and make sure that they're satisfied by day 17. Your preliminary title report. The preliminary title report is going to be delivered to you by the title company and or escrow company. You have 17 days to review that prelim and to make sure that it's acceptable to you. Your common interest disclosures, you have 17 days. And the review of leased or liened items like a solar panel or something like that, you have 17 days. Now, the assumption in all of those last ones is that you're going to get the documents within the time that they're designated to be sent to you, and then you're going to have a total of that 17-day marker to make sure you're satisfied with them. So what you should see after your contingency periods very clearly is that if you're representing the buyer, you have 17 days to do everything. By day 17, your transaction should be done. Everything should be smooth sailing by day 17. Now, the reason why it's not smooth sailing by day 17 is because either the listing agent is not being proactive in getting you the things, the seller's not being proactive, the escrow company's not being proactive. There is delays and delays with you being able to receive everything to make sure that you're comfortable and satisfied by day 17. So as a buyer's agent, you need to make sure that those first 5 to 10 days of this transaction, you are working hard and fast to line up every single document and inspection that is physically possible and to babysit everybody involved. You're following up with escrow, you're following up with title, you're following up with the lender, you're following up and making sure the appraisal is coming in on time. You're scheduling the inspections to get completed as quickly as possible. You want everything in front of you and prepped by at least day, 7 to 10? Because then from day 7 to 10 to day 17, you're reviewing everything with your buyer and deciding whether or not you're satisfied or not. Because at that point in time, we need to be discussing, are we going to be doing a request for repair? Are we happy with our contract? Is there any other investigations that we need? Or, hey, buyer, are we good to go? Like, are we ready? Are we just ready to chill and let this transaction close out like we know what we're buying now? You don't want to be beyond 17 days and then put yourself in that situation. And this is why all of the transactions become extremely stressful for our agents, is because they get to day 17 and nothing's done the way it's supposed to be. It's not buttoned up. It's not quite braided into the transaction quite smoothly and easily. And that's where things get a little bit stressful for us as agents. So day 17, that's the day that we're all looking for. All right, now we're moving into possession. Now, the buyers are going to be able to obtain possession upon recording of the home. So as soon as you receive notification that the property has recorded, then that is when the buyer can get their keys to their property. That's when they're supposed to get it, is upon notification of recording. And you can change that if you want to. So if that's going to be changed, you can amend that if you need to amend it. Next up is going to be M2. This is going to be discussing seller occupied or vacant units. Now, if you have a seller occupied property, then you're going to be dealing with an additional document. It's called the SIP, and it's going to be potentially a lease back to the seller or a seller to remain in possession for a specified period of time. That's not very common. You're not going to see that very often. But if your seller is going to be remaining in the property for greater than 30 days, then we need to make sure that we're going to be potentially doing the RLAS, which is the residential lease after the sale, or an SIP is a seller in possession if it's going to be for 29 days or less than 29 days. If you have a situation with one of these, by all means, give me a call. I'm happy to help guide you through a seller in possession if you're going to be dealing with one of those. Next up is a tenant-occupied property, and then you'd be pulling in your TOPA for a tenant-occupied property if you're going to have one. Now, most transactions that you're going to be dealing with, you're not going to want to be writing an offer on a tenant-occupied property if your buyer needs to occupy it in any specified period of time. If your buyer has a deadline in place, a tenant-occupied property or a seller in possession is going to be a little bit risky because these things are going to now be out of your control. You can't control when a tenant moves out. You can't always control when an owner moves out of a property. Contractually, we'd like to see them move out by the recording date, because the reason why these additional forms exist, your SIP, your RLAS, or your TOPA, is to try to protect the buyers and the sellers that if someone's going to be occupying the property after recording, what could happen? What are the other issues that we need to be aware of? The cleanest way you could ever go is to make sure that you're occupying your property upon recording. Right now, getting people evicted out of a property is a very long and time-consuming process. And when you think it's going to be smooth, or you think you're going to have them out within 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, it's just not going to work that way. It's definitely convoluted. So I would be very, definitely a buyer beware to accept a seller staying in place or a tenant staying in place. If you have a client that's willing to accept that, you need to make sure that you're having a lot of great counseling conversations with them, because this definitely is going to add some layers of risk for the buyers being able to occupy their own home later. All right? Okay, so I'm going to be pausing a little bit, and I want to fast forward through remaining on topic with writing your offer. You're going to see in the next section is going to be discussing, we're in paragraph grid 3N. This is what the seller is obligated to do. Timelines that the seller is obligated to meet. It doesn't always have to change when you're writing your offer. So there's not necessarily anything that you're required to change in the offer when you're writing it for a buyer. It's just kind of terms that are in the contract that you can leave alone, and they're built to kind of match what we need to be matched. So we're going to leave paragraph N alone. Now I'm on page 3 of your purchase contract. At the very top, I'm in paragraph 3 number. I'm in paragraph 3, item number P in the grid. P1 is going to talk about items that are included in the property at the time of sale. You want to take your time to go through this and make sure you've checked the boxes appropriately. These are the things that are going to transfer with the property. Some of these things can be considered personal property, not real property. So you need to make sure that if it's personal property that you have it attached. There's a lot of gray item areas that sometimes a buyer thinks should be included, but it may not naturally be included. Now, one of the things you're going to usually always check is going to be the stove. You want to make sure the stove is going to stay with the property. Some stoves are push-in stoves. So we have had some sellers remove a push-in stove, and we want that stove to stay with the property. You usually are going to always check dishwasher and microwave. If the microwave is the microwave that's above the stove, you want to make sure you have that checked. If it's a countertop microwave, usually that's going to be going with the seller. If your buyer asks for the refrigerator to stay and the washer and dryer to stay, you can check the boxes for the refrigerator and the washer and dryer to stay, but you do have to understand that those items are a little bit more considered personal property. So we can't verify the condition of the washer and dryer. They could be a horrible washer and dryer. They might not work, or they might break as soon as they move into the property. You're not verifying the condition of these items. You're just asking them to stay with the units. Sometimes washer and dryers and refrigerators I'm a little hesitant to include, because you do have those issues that when you find out that the refrigerator works terribly, then that you have an upset buyer. But the refrigerator was never really supposed to be part of the purchase of that house to begin with. So refrigerators are usually personal property. This is area specific also. There are some areas where it's more common for a refrigerator to stay, and some areas where it's common that the refrigerator goes. But you want to walk that through with your buyer. In the center, towards the bottom, actually the entire center of all of that, has to do with like the video and the recording and the sound and the electronic components of the house. And this is always a big one for the buyers, because if a buyer walks to the property and they see this gorgeous, huge, big screen TV in the living room, that's usually mounted by a very big bracket that's behind it. So if the seller is leaving, they will take their big screen TV, and usually they take the bracket that's holding it. Well, if they remove the bracket, there's going to be holes that are behind that bracket. So we need to figure out whether or not we want all of those wall-mounted brackets for the video and audio to stay. Now, usually the actual components, the TV, the cameras, things like that, they normally go, they leave, the seller takes them. But the brackets are kind of another issue. Do you want them to stay? Because remember, if they're removed, there's going to be a hole, right? So you have to kind of have that conversation with their buyer to discuss whether or not you want them to be removed or whether you want them to stay because of those reasons. All right, if there's any other additional items that are going to be included in the contract, you would include them there in this section. I would caution you to include high dollar value items. So I don't really think that this is the right area to discuss whether or not you want whether you're purchasing a car with the property. I know that would be very unusual, but a tractor, for example, might be staying with the farm. You might get someone talking about whether or not a pool table was going to stay with the property. The problem is this purchase contract is going to go to your appraiser, and it's going to go to the lender, and they're going to see, are these line items going to be valued or not valued when they're doing something. I try to ignore all of that. So if you have a seller that's wanting to sell furniture, if you're wanting a seller that's wanting to sell a big ticket item along with the purchase, I would use caution when it comes to including it in your purchase agreement in this section. I think that's far better handled in a different document that does not go to the lender and that does not go to your appraiser, that you can handle alongside of your escrow, okay? These are, next up in P2 would be items that would be excluded from your purchase of the property. Maybe you are buying an agricultural property. Maybe it's a farm. Maybe it has a ton of stuff outside and your buyer doesn't want any of it to stay. Maybe there's, all those extra sheds, or maybe there's a lot of debris on the property. Your buyer wants to make sure that every single one of those things are going to be removed. Well, then of course you're going to be excluding that from the sale. You need to get that out of here. Those old dead cars cannot stay. You could put excluded items there if you'd like to exclude them. Play sets in the backyard, things like that. All right, next up, this is a paragraph that you need to pay attention to. This is your allocation of cost. So we're still in the paragraph number 3. We're in grid Q for allocation of cost. First up, Q1 is going to be your natural hazard zone disclosure. It's standard, industry standard, more industry standard that a seller would pay for this. I'm being a little bit more cautious with saying what's industry standard versus not industry standard. So just so we're clear, there should be no set standard. Everything is negotiable. So when you're talking about a contract, everything is negotiable. But this is a class on how to write a contract in your particular area. What you will most commonly see is that your natural hazard zone disclosure is most frequently paid by the seller. So you're going to check the box that it's going to be paid by the seller. And on the right-hand side, under additional terms, you actually do want to check the box for environmental as well. So you'd want that top box to be checked for environmental, and provided by, you put whatever natural hazard zone disclosure you would prefer to see this going through right there. If you have a preference in natural hazard zone disclosures, you would fill it in the provided by section. Next up, item number Q2 and Q3. These are sections that you would complete if you're asking the seller to do any sort of additional inspection to the property. So you're going to see under Q3 that I wrote that we want a wood destroying pest report. You would call it a termite report. And I'm asking the seller to pay for just the report. Now, sometimes if people put in the contract that they want a termite clearance paid for by the seller, that's entirely different than asking for just the report. Now, most commonly, what you want to see is just the report coming in. If you ask for a clearance inside your purchase contract, you're predetermining that the seller is going to make repairs to anything that comes back on a termite report. Now, this is a little bit of a gray area as to whether or not it's acceptable to pre-lock a seller into something that they have no idea what the cost associated is going to be. So if you get into an area after the close of escrow or in the middle of the transaction where the seller gets upset and they're like, hey, yeah, I saw a termite clearance, They weren't thinking it through all the way, and the cost to cure is $5,000. Maybe it's a big termite issue in the property. The seller may not have wanted to commit themselves to that $5,000 fee. So writing in termite clearance or clear section A or something like that is a little bit riskier, kind of for all parties involved, because if there's a lot of termite damage, you could get into the center of a transaction that could get a little ugly for both the buyer and the seller. What if the seller wants to back out? What if they didn't want to pay that expense? There's a lot of issues. What we really want to see is we want to see the report. You want to ask the seller to pay for just the report. When that report comes back into you, that turns into a request for repair. At that point in time, if there's termite work, you're supposed to request for the seller to do the work through a request for repair. This is contractually probably the right way to handle the purchase agreement. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't, as a buyer, ask for the termite clearance or ask for the Section 1 items to be completed within the contract, and then your seller should be obligated to handle those Section 1 repairs if you write that in. But this is one of the terms that is more of a listing agent and a seller beware than it is a buyer beware. If I have a client and now I'm representing the listing, pretend like I'm the listing agent. If I'm representing the seller and I see that someone's asking for a clearance for all Section 1 items, then I would counter that out. I would say I would provide the report and I would handle out everything else after the fact. That's a term that I would personally counter. So if you're writing a clean offer, I would just ask for the report. That would be my recommendation. And wood destroying pests is also one of those reports. It's an additional report that most buyers choose to get. You don't have to put it in the contract, but you still can get the report. So let's say you're in a hot market and there's 20 offers on a property and you're trying to write the cleanest offer you possibly can. I might not put a wood destroying pest report in the contract. I might still get a wood destroying pest because I have the right to investigate that and I can handle that outside of escrow. It's more of a report for knowledge so my buyer knows what they're buying, but the buyer didn't want to make it a term of the contract, they just want to know what's in it. That's perfectly acceptable. It doesn't have to be within the contract, you could still choose to get it. This is purely if you're going to ask the seller to pay for the report itself, okay? All right, so that's wood destroying pest. If you're going to put it in there, most commonly I would say it's a seller request to be paid, but if your buyer wants to include the wood destroying pest in there, but they're saying, hey seller, look, I'm going to do it. I just want you to know I'm going to get the report and I'm going to pay for it. That would be a good way to do it as well. All right, a very clean offer would be entering in the termite pest inspection report there and saying your buyer is going to pay for it. All right. Now, on this next item, we're grid 3-4, smoke alarm, CO detectors, water heater bracing. It is most common to see that this is a seller paid item, so we check the box for the seller. Now, I have in Q5 and Q6 for government required repairs and point of sale repairs and inspections, I always mark seller. Mark seller, mark seller. If you don't know, just mark seller on those ones, because especially as a newer agent, which most of you guys that I'm teaching in these classes are a little bit newer agents, you might not know if there's a government required report. You might not know if there's a required inspection or if there's a point of sale issue on these properties. So the worst case scenario, if you check seller, the seller is going to counter it out for you. Best case scenario, you're protecting your buyer, asking the seller to take on one of those reports for you. Now, this is also area specific. So there are some government required point of sale inspections in LA that you have to do. So if you're within certain city limits, then there are point of sale inspections that need to be done. There could be point of sale inspections in lots of different areas based upon where the property is located. You can call and ask the listing agent if there are any point of sale requirements. But again, that's just going off of a verbal. I like to do everything contractually. So if I don't know, I'm going to check seller and make the seller counter it back out if they don't like it. At that point in time, at least I've done my due diligence and tried to protect my buyer in that. Okay, next item is Q7 for your escrow fee. On escrow fee, you are going to check the box all the way to the right, each to pay their own fees, and you want to type in your escrow holder there. So you type in escrow 1 for your escrow company and each to pay their own fees. Why are we doing each to pay their own fees? Is because the fees that the buyer has to pay and the fees that the seller has to pay when closing an escrow are very different. Usually, a buyer's fees are more expensive than a seller's fees because usually a buyer has a loan that's going to work in coordination with that escrow. So all of those fees are going to get integrated onto the buyer side fees. So sometimes you'll see people check the box that says both and they'll put 50-50. That is incorrect. You never want to check 50-50. You always want to check each to pay their own. So again, if you're the listing agent, you're going to want to watch this section. You'd want to counter that back to each to pay their own fees. It's a bit of a negotiation in this section, but you'd like to see that happen. As far as your escrow holder goes, you also want to use an escrow holder that has an excellent reputation and that you have the ability to get answers from. So you want to be able to pop into their office and say, hey, where are we at? You don't want your escrow holder to be able to hide from you anywhere, behind a phone or behind their email system. So you want to use a local escrow company, if at all possible, for your transaction. And so you'll see here I have put escrow 1. For your title insurance policy, the owner's title insurance policy is most commonly paid for by the seller, so you'd be checking the box seller, and then you'd put down the title company that you prefer. So you'll see that I have All Cal Title because I really like working with All Cal Title personally. So owner's title insurance policy, seller, All Cal. Now, with all of these services that are here, your buyers have the options to call around. They could use any escrow company they want to. They could use any title company they want to. They could use any NHD company they want to. But usually they're going to be looking for your guidance in this to a certain amount because they don't know who all these companies are. So we want to make sure that we're going to be giving these clients to a company who's going to take really good care of them, that has a good reputation. All right? Now, we're going to move down to your county transfer tax and city transfer tax, which is item number Q10 and Q11. If you don't know, you're going to check seller on both of these. It's most common to check seller on both of these, so you'll see those as a seller line item in Q11 and Q10 and Q11. Item number Q14 for your HOA transfer fees. You're only going to check these boxes if the property is located in an HOA. If it is located in an HOA, I would put that as a seller fee. That would be my recommendation. We're going to move down to item number Q16 and 17. You're going to see that there is a blank spot for fees or cost. So you don't necessarily have to fill in anything there as far as being a buyer's agent goes. If you are the listing agent, you want to double check those two sections. Things can hide there, so it's a hiding section. You can see that it's really kind of close together, so it's hard to see all of those little sections that are in there, so make sure you double check 16 and 17. Item number Q18. This is going to be your home warranty plan. I also highly recommend that you get your buyer a home warranty plan. It's another little insurance. It's a risk reduction item for both the seller and the buyer, kind of makes them happy clients. Now, you want to make sure you price this correctly. So let's say you find your favorite home warranty company, whoever that home warranty company happens to be. You need to make sure that the price that the home warranty company package that you select is accounted for in the contract. So in this particular section, you'll see that I've selected Old Republic. I went to Old Republic's website and I decided with my buyer, I went through this with my buyer of what they wanted to have coverage for. My buyer told me that they wanted coverage for the ultimate package, not the standard package, so one step up is ultimate, and they also wanted to make sure the air conditioning unit was covered. So I did the ultimate package plus the AC package. I double checked the price that was on that and it came to a total of $710. That will cover the package that my buyer wants for their coverage, and I'm asking the seller to pay for that in this offer. Now, you can, if it's a competitive market, say, you know, buyer, I highly recommend you get this, and they put that in there that it could be a buyer's fee if you want it to be a buyer's fee. I have seen agents pay for this as a closing gift. It gets a little bit hefty, but I've seen agents decide that they are going to provide these to their clients as well. But if you're going to put it in an offer, it's still pretty common to see this as a seller charge. And I actually like presenting this to a seller because I think this is a great risk reduction item for the seller, that they're not going to come back to the seller 30 days into escrow and 30 days after the close of escrow and say, my air conditioner broke and you knew it was having problems, now you owe me. Come fix my air conditioner. Well, I like making sure that there's another company in place that can handle some of those items that might pop up. So I think it's kind of like an insurance policy for both the seller and the buyer. So if you're presenting this to the seller, that's how I would present it. It's a little bit of an insurance policy for them for small items that may be wrong in the house with the electrical systems, some of the plumbing items, and the AC unit if the AC unit is asked for. I do highly recommend the AC unit if you're going to ask for one of these, because that's one of those items that we seem to have issues with. Your buyers will also have items with things like the dishwashers and the stoves. So all of that would be covered in a package like this. Make sure you get the pricing right if you can. If the pricing is not right, let's say that this actually costs $750. This actually is telling the escrow company the seller has approved $710, but it actually costs $750, which the difference between those two costs is going to fall to the buyer at that point in time. Okay, so there will be a difference in that. Okay, now we are moving on to page 4 of the contract, and this is going to be any additional property addendums that need to be attached to this contract. So spend some time on the top of this page. If you have a property that happens to be a manufactured home, if you have a property that is a probate sale, if you have a property that has a septic or a well or a propane tank, you need to check the box and pull that document in. So you have to make sure that if it's a manufactured home, you have the MHPA attached. You have to make sure that if it's a septic, that you have the form that's a SWIPI attached, which is your SWPI. And then you want to make sure that you fill those out correctly. So the top of page 4, don't ignore it. There are boxes that you need to be aware of and that you need to check to make sure you get those documents in. You're going to see that it naturally is going to pull in on item number 4C. It's already checking the boxes for the documents that were included with the purchase contract naturally when you opened this. So you have the buyer's investigation advisory, you have the wire fraud advisory, fair housing, and you have the California Consumer Privacy Act. Those are all naturally included. But look 2 down from that. Do you see where it says statewide buyer and seller advisory, or SBSA? Now, if you don't check the box for the SBSA, it is not included in your contract. Therefore, it's not a requirement of the contract to be completed. Now, I do highly recommend that you begin to check this SBSA. It's an excellent disclosure. It's a protection disclosure. It tells the buyer every single system and component that they should be making sure that it's their responsibility to make sure that they're comfortable with those systems and components. So I really feel like this should automatically be checked within our contract, but it is not. So you have to go to page 4 and you have to review section 4 of this contract and make sure your statewide buyer and seller advisory is attached. Same thing, if you are working with a property that is in maybe Tehachapi and you're in a wildfire disaster area, you need to make sure you're including that form. So please don't ignore page 4 and item 4. There are definitely some important disclosures that you need to incorporate into these purchase contracts as you're filling it out. Now, page 5 is just going to be talking about closing, possession, and contingencies. We're going to talk far more about this when we get into our transactional purchase contract class. That's going to be talking about pivotal moments inside your real estate transaction where these things are going to pop up. And obviously you can see this contract is very long. We're on page 5 of 16 already, and I want to take the time to really dive into these. But for today's class, we're talking about how to write the contract. So we're going to skip through some of these forms that are just describing features to us about what happens during the transaction. All right? So we're skipping that. We're skipping page 6. We're skipping page 7. Skipping page 8. We're going to come all the way down here to page 14. All right. On page 14, we're talking about liquidated damages and arbitration. Now, there's nothing for you to fill out here. This is purely, once you get to this page, I just want you to know whether or not we're going to be initialing these boxes or not, because they're optional for your buyer to initial. So when you get to when you're filling out your contract and you're done filling out all those topics that we've already discussed, you're going to click send and you're going to send it to your buyer to review them. Your buyer is going to get the contract and they're going to get to this page on liquidated damages and arbitration, and they're going to see that it's an option whether or not to check or initial the liquidated damages clause, which is in box 29, or the arbitration clause, which is in box 31. So that's an optional section for them to sign. Now, what are these items? Because they're going to call you and they're going to ask. Now, liquidated damages clause means that you're going to enter into this contract, and if all parties initial this, both the buyer and the seller, it's actually going to be telling you that they're agreeing to limit the damages if something were to go wrong to 3% of the purchase price. Now, in some areas, remember, your earnest money deposit could be 3%. So the amount of money that is at risk is 3%. It's your earnest money deposit. It was, in this case, with a $500,000 purchase price, we're talking about $15,000. So if everyone chooses to initial this box, we're agreeing, both the buyer and the seller is agreeing, that if something goes wrong in the transaction, we're going to have a limit on what we think the damages are going to be, and that's liquidated damages of 3%. Okay? Now, in our case, our deposit was only 1%. We have a $5,000 deposit. So if something goes wrong with this transaction, we have the $5,000 deposit on file. So you will, and take your time to read these because you want to be able to explain them to your client properly. Now, we're not an attorney, so there are limitations as to what we can tell our client and whether or not they should accept liquidated damages for arbitration. It's not our job to decide whether they're going to accept it, and it's really a gray area to how deep we explain this as well. If they have questions, deeper questions than you have the capability of answering, then you need to refer that back to an attorney. Say, you know what, it sounds like you're a little bit more concerned about the liquidated damages and arbitration clauses that I may be able to help you with. Let me refer you to an attorney that you can ask them a couple questions really quickly to make sure you're comfortable with this, if you want to take that step. But liquidated damages is basically going to limit the damages to that 3%. Now, on liquidated damages, I want you to read the very first few sentences. It says, if buyer fails to complete this purchase because of buyer's default, seller shall retain as liquidated damages the deposit actually paid. So the deposit actually paid in our transaction is $5,000. So then it talks about what the total of liquidated damages can be, and that won't exceed the 3%. All right, so we have two issues in liquidated damages. Now, mediation is the center paragraph. That doesn't change. That's not an option. That's in every contract. Mediation means if something goes wrong, the parties are agreeing to mediate. They're agreeing to go sit with a mediator and try to talk through this issue with a mediator. Now, inside the mediation, whatever is decided upon in mediation doesn't mean that they can't still go to court and sue you. It just means you're going to try mediation. Now, when you step into arbitration, this is where it gets a little bit different. This is similar to mediation, except for you're going to be with a retired judge. Someone has a minimum amount of experience. I believe it's 5 years of legal experience or law experience with real estate law. And they're agreeing to go and meet with an arbitrator to try to settle their disputes. So these paragraphs are optional paragraphs. You don't have to do anything as the agent. You're going to email them to your client. Your client will select whether or not they want to actually do that liquidated damages or arbitration themselves. It's not our decision. Now, if your buyer initials these contracts and your seller does not want to initial these contracts, then you have to handle that in a counteroffer. These need to match. They need to agree to either liquidated damages or not agree to liquidated damages, and same thing with arbitration. Okay, now we're getting towards your signature pages. So on the top, this is very important because we're getting a lot of entity buyers. If you have an entity buyer, we're in paragraph number 32, please fill out the entity buyer box in item number 32B. You need to check that you have an entity. What is an entity? An entity is a trust. An entity is an LLC. Those are things that you're going to commonly deal with. If you're working with a buyer that's a trust or an LLC, you would check that they're an entity buyer, and you would fill out the information in item number B2 and 3, and all of the information regarding the entity direct from their entity paperwork. And you need to make sure that their name lines up with the signers that are your entity buyers, okay? This will save you a step of having to do an RCSD. Now, if you don't check entity buyers, but it is an entity buyer, you can handle that in escrow. Maybe you don't know and you just want to write the offer really quickly. Fine, don't check the box. Once you get into escrow, you need to complete the RCSD at that point in time, okay? Now, in this scenario, my buyer, Donald J. Trump, is going to be signing under 32. He's not buying as an entity. When I send this to him, it will be either DocuSigned or DigiSigned back to me with the correct dates and times that are on there. And then this is going to be with the seller for signature. They can choose to accept or counter this. If you are representing the seller, you do need to make sure you're checking the darn boxes. Under item number 33, sometimes the seller counters the offer, but they're not checking the boxes that they countered the offer. You've got to do it correctly. You got to check the box that you're countering an offer, then send the counter offer that goes with it. If you have a seller entity, you also fill this out on the purchase agreement, page 15. It'll save you the step of the RCSD. If you don't know, you can do the RCSD once you're under contract still. You will see on item number 33, our seller is Joe Biden, and you will see under this particular scenario, I did use the word Joe, but you know that I should have double checked with his title because Joe is obviously Joseph. I actually think he's a third or a fourth or something like that as well. So I would get his legal name, his official legal name. I'm assuming is Joe Biden because that's what we know him as. And I'm going to pull the seller's information directly from the MLS or from the tax documentation. And my example here, I believe Joe Biden is correct in this offer, so that's why I went with Joe Biden on this one. And he is our seller that will get signed on this page right there. All right, last up, page 16. You need to make sure this is filled out. I don't know why agents do not fill out this section. This is legally where you're telling the seller that they can get a hold of you. So throughout this entire contract, we've been talking about time is of the essence with time periods, contingency periods, and we're also going to talk about delivery dates. Okay, well, maybe you sent a notice of buyer to perform. What day did you send the notice of buyer to perform, and where did you send it? This is giving them your official and legal receipt of where you want delivery to happen at. If you don't fill it out, then you're not meeting terms of the contract. Same thing with the seller. So you'll see that I filled out all of my information in the section for myself, but I also put the designated email and text message in there as well that it's designated that they can reach out to me. So that is going to finalize our offer for today. Attached to this, you're going to see additional documentation. In the additional documentation, we have the buyer's investigation advisory. The buyer's investigation advisory is just going to tell the buyer the different systems and components that they need to make sure that they're inspecting during their transaction. And it's very similar to your SBSA, except for the SBSA is much thicker and a better document even than the buyer investigation advisory. You're going to have your Fair Appraisal Act addendum, and this is going to pull in with your contract. And your California Consumer Privacy Act advisory, disclosure, and notice is going to pull in, and that's going to be the very end of your contracts for today. Thank you for joining me today on the road to sold. If you like the information, hit subscribe below. We're going to make sure to give you a lot of great informative information on our channel.